subject is someone to be proud of on both sides of the Atlantic. We hear about the founding fathers of America. This person is a founding mother. She might be the most important American you've never heard of. And here she is. As a young woman, this is Phillis Wheatley. She died age only 31. She always suffered from a delicate constitution with chronic asthma attacks, and this is probably what killed her in the end. The only portrait, this one, is by Scipio Moorhead, who was a black artist, and it appears in her book of poems. And you can see in the image she has a pen in her hand. She's writing or about to write, and she's looking up. Phillis was almost always looking up. It's worth saying that portraits of individuals were rare at that time, and it was really, if I may say, revolutionary to have her portrait so widely disseminated in so-called high culture. And while we're doing show and tell, let me mention this book by Richard Kygell about Phillis, which we've been really pleased to have. It's been a revelation to us. And I've recently been in correspondence with Richard. Some of his notes have helped with this content today. So back to Phillis, what was her story? She was seized age 7 in Africa, probably from Senegal or Gambia, and transported to America on the brutal Middle Passage, as it was called, a journey of 8 months in appalling conditions, on arrival to be sold as a slave. Now, even her name is not really her own. She was given the name Phillis, which was the name of the ship that she was on. Wheatley is the name of the family who bought her in Boston to be a domestic slave. Now, it so happened that Susanna Wheatley, the lady of the family, had lost a daughter, Sarah, age 7, and maybe little Phillis Wheatley in some way took the place of that child who so sadly died. The Wheatley family gave her an education, and by the age of 12, she was reading Greek and Latin. She got an education that would have been remarkable for a woman of any race, and to be frank, in any period. But she had extraordinary aptitude. She had a tremendous retention of knowledge. Shakespeare, Horace, Virgil, Ovid. Having gobbled up all these, age 14, she starts to write her own poetry. Initially, it was her elegies that gained her international recognition for their thoughtful, compassionate, and religious content. So an example of one title is A Funeral Poem on the Death of C.E. She just gives the initials, an infant of 12 months. But more than just condolence, her elegies became actually profound reflections on the meaning of life, death, and immortality. But let's have a quick look at an extract of her most anthologized poem called On Imagination. Imagination, who can sing thy force? Or who describe the swiftness of thy course? Soaring through air to find the bright abode, the imperial palace of the thundering god. We on thy pinions can surpass the wind and leave the rolling universe behind. From star to star the mental optics rove, measure the skies and range the realms above. There in one view we grasp the mighty whole, or with new worlds amaze the unbounded soul. So this is not so easy to read now. It's very ornate, but I hope you can hear there's a musicality about it. We can see classical references, a masterly command of rhyme, rhythm. She soars up to the heavens, God, and perhaps most importantly, transcending where she was. It ends with the unbounded soul. Remember, of course, she was a slave. I personally like to think that she felt a real connection with the muses, and that perhaps this was not just a literary device for her. I think maybe it was an experience she felt deeply and repeatedly. Another aspect of Phillis Wheatley is her keen engagement with current events. For example, she even wrote a poem to King George praising him for repealing the detested Stamp Act. But in Boston, people didn't believe that these poems were written by a black poet, so it required an attestation by several eminent people to confirm that she was actually the author of these poems. Even with this, in 1773 in America, there was still a reluctance to publish Phillis Wheatley. So Susanna funded a trip to London where Susanna knew her protege would have a better reception. Now, interestingly, in England, the year before Phillis Wheatley arrived, the law had changed so that any slave who set foot in England was now free. So now a free woman in London, Phillis Wheatley was recognized as a genius, and her book was published here. And Phillis also had the chance to visit many tourist attractions we know today: the Tower, Westminster Abbey, even Sadler's Wells Theatre. There was a dazzling array of important people she met or corresponded with, including William Wilberforce and his family, and the Countess of Huntingdon. Then back later in America, she met Benjamin Franklin and possibly even also met George Washington. So where she is now in London as a free woman, Phillis Wheatley is not obliged to return, but she came back to Boston after only a few weeks, maybe called back due to Susanna's declining health. So from the high life in London, she came back to a different sort of party, the Boston Tea Party. Now, by extraordinary coincidence, Phillis Wheatley's newly published books were sent back to the US on a ship called the Dartmouth, which also contained chests of tea. The ship arrived in Boston and was immediately impounded due to the tea. It was a very anxious time for Phillis, worrying that her books would be dumped in the harbour along with the tea. Luckily, she was able to secure the release of her books. So now a free woman in America, Phillis continued to live with the Wheatleys for some time. It was a bitter blow to Phillis when Susanna Wheatley died in 1774. I think that tells you something about the interesting relationship between Phillis Wheatley and the Wheatley family. In 1775, Boston was besieged. General George Washington was dismayed. He was facing a position that was dangerous and uncertain. He had not enough men and a crisis of ammunition. And at this point, Phillis Wheatley wrote the most consequential poem of her career, To George Washington. Showering him with accolades, we can safely assume she filled him with spirit and confidence at a critical time. So just a couple of lines, she said, "Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine, with gold unfading, Washington, be thine." As somebody put it, she became the unofficial poet laureate of the new nation in the making. It's worth noting that Washington replied to her, inviting her to pay a social visit, and this was truly revolutionary for him to reply to a black former slave. So this was the time of forging of a new nation, but the colonial states needed to be united with a common image. And if you cast your mind back, this was before the Statue of Liberty and Uncle Sam, which gained so much traction, especially during World War II. So before those, it was Phillis who created in words the image of Columbia, the personification of America as a nation. So Phillis is regarded as a genius for her poetry. I think she's also a genius for her involvement and even influence on the tumultuous events of her time, and the subtlety of managing her position as a black slave, commenting on slavery and freedom in a way that was actually digestible in a society that was so deeply prejudiced. More a poet than a philosopher, agreed, but the theme of freedom is very strong in her writings. She was clever and subtle, especially in drawing parallels between the hunger for freedom of black slaves and the colonies wanting to be free of British rule. She's not recognized enough for all she gave. Let's acknowledge what she did. This was a remarkable woman who achieved so much in a tragically short life. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave us a comment, subscribe to our channel, and I hope you'll like and share it, especially with American friends. Thank you so much for watching.